Attendees are in listen-only mode.
So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. James Cowling here. Thank you for attending, all of you. And just as usual, we'll give anybody who's just got a reminder popping up on their screen just about a minute to jump start. So thank you for coming. We're going to talk about multi-factor authentication. Some of you may have been on my previous webinar about authentication protocols and attacks on them. This is kind of extending that a little bit. So let's get into it, because we've got quite a few things to get through. And just a question about, a point about questions. If you do have a question, you can by all means type it into the questions pane and see if I notice it. Sometimes I get on a roll and don't notice. If I don't do it in line, then don't panic. I'll take a look at the end, and should have some time to clear up any questions if you have any, but do ask them in line as we go along, and I'll see if I can get to them as we go along. So first of all, then, what are we going to talk about? The usual thing, account security is one of my hobby horses. So we'll talk about what we mean by account security and some of the attacks on account security, a little bit about authentication factors, and then we'll get straight into the MFA stuff and attacks on it. Fido is going to be an issue. Fido is on everybody's lips about MFA at the moment, so we'll be talking about that in detail as well. So I suppose we don't need to be persuaded about why account security is important, but I couldn't leave it unsaid. So we're seeing a lot of fines and embarrassment and lost confidence and things surrounding the various data thefts. Not all of them were a problem of account security, but very many reconnaissance activities by attackers begin by trying to hack into some internal identity so that they can reconnoiter the network. And so improving our security and understanding the threats to the account security is a pretty key thing that we spend our lives doing. So I just wanted quickly to ask you, it won't take a second, just if you wanted to share it with me, what your role is. We do this at the beginning of most webinars. You don't have to answer these questions. By all means, ignore me if you don't want to. But if you wouldn't mind just letting me know where you stand, I would just give us a way of pitching this a little bit. Shouldn't take you long to vote on this one. Not really controversial, so 5 more seconds. I think we've got you all, nearly all. Okay, good enough. Thank you. So how do people attack our accounts? We've already talked about protocol security. So I've talked about bearer tokens. I've talked about attacks on tokens, replay of tokens, spoofing of tokens. I talked about that in my last webinar. If anybody would like to see the recording, it's on our website. If you weren't able to be there in person. This particular webinar really focuses around passwords, although not exclusively. When we talk about multi-factor authentication, typically we're talking about factors additional to passwords, but we will qualify that as we go along. There are plenty of attacks that multi-factor authentication doesn't help with, but attacks on our passwords are pretty common and worth defending against. So the password attacks that we are mostly interested in, the less subtle ones, spray attacks where very common passwords are tried against millions of accounts. So they spray common passwords against millions of accounts in case someone is using 12345 as their password, or brute force attacks, trying dictionary attacks or other sorts of brute force attacks on specific accounts to try and crack into them. So those are the sort of blunt password attacks that we need to defend against. There are other social attacks, particularly involving phishing, where I'm sure we all get dozens of emails every day probably, telling us that our Office 365 account needs reauthorizing, or some parcel needs collecting, or if only we click on this website, something interesting would happen. And most of those, of course, are invitations to visit some malicious website that is either intending to plant malicious software on our machine, or it's planning to impersonate the target website and encourage us to enter a username and password that we think is going to DHL or FedEx or Microsoft or someone. And of course, the attacker is aiming to capture our credentials and reuse them for their own malicious purposes. So phishing attacks, very common, very easy to set up, and very much a threat to our passwords. and we need to pay attention to those. Business email compromise, just worth talking about because it's a social attack. CEO fraud, it's sometimes known as. So these are the attacks where emails are sent to the accounts department pretending to be from the CEO, saying please transfer large amounts of money to this account in the Cayman Islands as soon as possible, or whatever. Of course, slightly more subtly than that. Some of those compromises start with a phishing attack and an account compromise. So there have been documented cases of business email compromise being initiated by somebody who is actually sitting in the account watching the email go past. So they know exactly when the CEO has just sent an email saying transfer lots of money, and they send an email after that saying correction to the account number, it's this account number you need. So there are more sophisticated attacks involving phishing and account takeover before the compromise, but quite a lot of it just happens with email spoofing. I know people have been subject to those attacks and they can be quite scary. Clearly, I think it's clear, multi-factor authentication isn't really going to help us with those, but I mention it here for completeness. The business of impersonation and scamming is important to us mainly because they're very, very common. So phone calls from some guy somewhere saying, I am a Microsoft support guy and I've noticed that your computer has been compromised. If you give me your password, I'll help you fix it. I also know people who've fallen for that one. So that's okay. Not again, if someone's that blunt and you give them your password, then you're pretty much done for. But the scamming part of it, it's also an attack on multi-factor authentication. So if we will in a minute talk about the use of mobile phones for various purposes in multi-factor authentication, particularly with respect to the receiving of one-time passwords via an SMS. And there are plenty of scams documented where people call your mobile phone provider and claim to be you and say, sob story, I've lost my mobile phone and I badly need a new SIM card to go in this new phone, and if you'd only please do it, and I've forgotten my password and it's really urgent because my cat's lost or something. So, and in that case, it does happen. I think the statistic I saw was something like 30% of a sort of secret shopper approach. 30% were actually successful in persuading the person on the end of the line to release a new SIM card without the customer's password. So it is possible for people to scam their way into your mobile phone account and therefore to compromise your multi-factor authentication, if that is what you're using. However, those are the attacks that I'm mainly interested in here. We're not going to go into much detail apart from on the phishing side. Phishing and brute force password attacks are the ones we're mostly interested in with reference to multi-factor auth. We, I think, can accept, there's plenty of good blogs and things around, but I think we can accept that passwords are fundamentally vulnerable, and we consider adding additional factors. So let's talk about it. Variants of multi-factor auth. It's very difficult for me to be 100% complete on this. Of course, there are so many different ways of doing this, but these are the widely accepted ones. So multi-factor, sometimes two-factor authentication, assumes that the first factor is a password. That has historically been the case, that a password is there, and we're trying to make the password more robust by adding another factor. The thing we need to bear in mind is that a password is simply something we know. And when we apply other factors, we may be able to replace the password completely, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The first thing we ought to talk about, kind of probably the oldest approach, are the out-of-band factors. These are typically one-time passwords sent to your phone as an SMS or possibly to your private email account or some such thing. Fundamentally, slightly better than passwords, better than just having a password for sure. Still basically something you know your password to your email account, for example. And so you're really in the sort of the basics of it, replacing one thing you know with, or augmenting one thing you know with the second thing you know. Both things can be found out by somebody else, your email password, for example, particularly if it's the same password you use somewhere else. And I've just talked about the idea that your phone can be hijacked with social engineering and your SMSs can be redirected to somebody else's phone. So these are not fantastically secure, but they certainly make brute force password attacks a great deal harder. Then we have device factors or hardware token factors. These could be apps on phones. They could be hardware one-time password tokens. I think we've probably all had one or more of these in our hands in the past. These are at least something you have in your possession. So that makes it a great deal harder for somebody to remotely attack your account without stealing it from you. Very commonly, they also incorporate something you know. So your phone is probably by policy secured with a PIN, or possibly a PIN and a biometric, or a PIN or a biometric factor like a fingerprint. So we might decide in that case, if the second factor contains elements of something you have and something you know, my first idea of having to have a password becomes obsolete and I can just live without it. So we might move in that direction. I've already mentioned biometric factors. We have fingerprints on phones and things. These are quite widely in use, of course, face recognition, iris scans, fingerprints, and this sort of thing. As secondary factors, this is usually via some form of dedicated reader, some device that is capable, of course, of reading one of these things. My app-based authentication requires me to give it my fingerprint before it releases the authenticator. So yeah, a little bit of biometrics there. That's something we are, as I'm sure we all know, the combination of something you know, something you have, and something you are is generally seen as a good, secure mix. Now, I mentioned these really just for completeness. I'm not pretending they're all created equal. Some of them are better than others, and I'm generally interested, if you wouldn't mind sharing. Again, you don't have to share. I'm going to put up a poll. If you have MFA, which variants do you use? I'm just interested. Again, we're not remotely interested in distributing this information, but if you care to share, I'll give you 20 seconds just to let me know if you use any of these. You can make multiple choices. Obviously, you may need more than one different variant in your organization. I'll give it a couple more seconds. I think I've probably gathered all the votes I'm going to get. Fair enough. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so about just so that you know, nobody on the poll is using biometric or Fido, and all the other ones are in broad use. So that's kind of what I expected. So what I want to do now is drill down a little bit into the background technologies here and understand the attack approach that is made particularly by phishing and man-in-the-middle attacks, because we need to understand the processes so we understand how secure MFA is, which is, let's face it, the title of this webinar. So basic authentication is usually presented something like this. We have a user on the right, we have some sort of service on the left. There is a shared secret, it's our password in this case, and we have a device in the middle. A username is presented, the server challenges us with some random, usually random challenge, and we hash that random item with our password typically and send it back. The server is in a position to do the same hash on the same challenge with the same password and presumably come up with the same answer if I've done it right. Again, this is a gross generalization, but this is typically how many authentications work based on passwords. But we're seeing a shared secret and we're seeing a pretty simple setup. In practice, of course, this isn't really the way our worlds are working these days. Our world looks a lot more like this, where instead of a user logging in from a single device to a single service, we have some form of web server, some let's call it technically a relying party or a web server, presents us with a login form and uses some identity provider somewhere, whether it's Active Directory on premises or whether it's some federation server or cloud provider of some sort in the background. So this is more likely to be the architecture we're interested in. And again, the process is very similar, except the question is, where is the process happening? So the secure authentication is happening between the web server and the identity provider. All I do from my client is provide the web server with my username and password and hope that I can trust it. Now, there are plenty of situations, of course, where I can't trust it. So I have, in this case, clicked on one of those famous phishing emails, and instead of going to the Microsoft site I was expecting, I've gone to a man-in-the-middle, a phishing attack site, presenting me with either a proxied or a completely faked form, which looks identical to the Microsoft form, and they are extremely identical in many cases, just from a graphics point of view. And I provide very generously the attacker with my username and password. So, of course, the attacker is then in the position to use my username and password, either automatically or manually, to access the web server in question. Then they know whether the username and password are correct. The back end is, of course, unaware of what's going on at the front end, so the authentication will take place. the attacker has my username and password and is free to do many things. There is no further authentication here, so the attacker can reuse that username and password. It's possible, as we know, that users reuse passwords on different services, so this attacker may now have access to further services in my name, but at the very least is probably in a position to change my password on this service and effectively take over my identity. So without any further authentication, the attacker is entirely free to make hay with my username and password. The unpleasant thing about this is that if the job's done well, I don't know I've been hacked. I thought I went to a website and got what I was looking for from it, because the man in the middle is proxying the website back to me and showing me what I expect. So I've given him my credentials, and I don't even know I've done it, and I have no immediate reason to change my password, right? So pretty well-known stuff, but that's what's basically going on with the man in the middle attack, and the man in the middle has now my key. So we might try to enhance this with, let's say, an out-of-band one-time password. So we set it up, I register my mobile phone number somewhere, and when I present my username, either before or after my password, doesn't really matter, I get a one-time password sent to me by the back end, part of the back end, doesn't really matter which, and I have a one-time password. That one-time password gets entered either as an extension to my password or as an additional factor, and that is part of the authentication process, and I get authenticated again. Nothing very magical about this, and equally nothing very magical about the man in the middle, who receives the one-time password just as well as the backend does. The backend receives the one-time password, logs me in, the man in the middle has my username and password. Now, we've made a big difference to the man in the middle's life, to the extent that he's probably going to find it hard to repeat this act, at least on this server, without me noticing. Now, it depends a little bit on how stupid I am as a user. If I'm a user who just approves any or doesn't notice when one-time passwords arrive that I didn't request, then I'm going to get taken for a ride. But the man in the middle finds it very hard to repeat this without getting hold of my mobile phone number, for example, to receive my one-time passwords, or without hacking my email account. Unless, of course, I have reused this username and password somewhere else, in which case they can probably do all sorts of interesting things. So just by adding this simple thing here, we've made a big difference to the man in the middle's life, made it a great deal harder, but he's still got my password, and he's still got a session with this web server, and in that session, he may be able to do some damage. You may find it hard to repeat that session on this web server because he won't have the one-time password unless he's managed to hack my mobile phone. But nevertheless, some damage can be done. So this is not unphishable, is the point, this approach. It still leaves us to some extent vulnerable to phishing attacks. We can compare this then with time-based one-time passwords, TOTPs. This could be a phone-based app or a one-time-based one-time password token of some sort. Similar sort of approach, synchronized clocks on the back end and the front end, generating a known one-time password at any point in time. I enter the password, all is good. It's very similar to the other one-time password and similarly hackable. So again, the attacker is not going to be able to repeat this game unless they somehow compromise the registration keys on my mobile, which is not beyond the wit of man. If you get the registration keys out of my Authenticator app, you can repeat that registration just by copying the keys. So it is possible to attack time-based one-time passwords, particularly from phone apps, if you also have hacking approaches to the phone itself. Hardware tokens a bit more difficult. So yeah, so again, same sort of thing. The freedom of movement of the man in the middle is restricted, but not zeroed out. So they still get a session, they'll still get a cookie back from the web server probably. They may even be able to reissue that same cookie for a new session, at least for a time-limited period. So we have opened the door to the man in the middle to some extent. Moving on to two-way approval. So again, out of band, so in principle a good thing. But this is an exclusive conversation between me and the backend server. My app sends the response straight to the backend server without going through the presenting web server, possibly with biometrics, possibly with all sorts of good things. These devices are harder to compromise, again, because they tend to have biometric confirmations and things associated with them. So compromising the device is quite hard. The attack is similar. I've sent my username and password via the man in the middle. I've approved the whole thing in the background, and the man in the middle, as long as he has done his attack in a sensible time frame, will get authenticated into the back end server, will get a session, probably will get a cookie, will be able to misuse that in some way. Again, freedom of movement is limited. They still ideally would, if they really want to use my username and password repeatedly here, they're probably going to need to compromise my device in some way. But it's a decent defense, but it's not entirely unphishable, and it does release private information, including my password, to an attacker. What they can do with it depends on how often I've reused that and how sophisticated the attacker is on other bands. Okay, so those are the main, if you like, currently in use, and certainly from your poll, the primary in-use multi-factor authentications. A great deal better than nothing. Generally speaking, they protect against brute force password attacks, because no password attack is going to go through without the multi-factor authentication to go with it. But generally, the phishing attacks are going to generate some useful information for an attacker. By no means, they're absolutely not worthless, but they're not 100% proof against phishing. So the question is there one that is entirely proof against phishing? And this is really what I want to talk to you about. There is a variant of multi-factor auth that does prevent phishing entirely, and I think it's interesting to know what that is and how it works. So I'm going to tell you. You'll probably have heard of this. So Fido has been around for, I think, 3 or 4 years by now. 200 plus companies, really with one goal in mind, and that is first of all, to improve the security of passwords, but primarily to get rid of passwords. This is basically their goal in life. You'll see, I just grabbed a screenshot from their website a couple of days ago, so this is fairly current, but you can see Microsoft, you can see Amazon, you can see Google, and so on. One of the things that we as IT pros need to be aware of is that Fido makes a very clear separation between user verification and authentication. And it's not really something I think that IT pros are focused on, unless you're a security person. We typically worry about authentication, but user verification hasn't really been our primary goal. But Fido is very focused on verification. So just to draw a line between them, authentication, the process of establishing identity with a service. So authentication is between my device and my providing server need to have some identity relationship so that they know the context in which to provide the service, and that is generated during the authentication process. Verification is different. That's the confirmation that the identity that's being presented for authentication is really present and belongs to the person who's actually present. There are cases when we need things like impersonation and so on for various types of accounts, and in that case, these technologies wouldn't necessarily be the ones we choose to protect them. But nevertheless, for 99% of consumer and end user activity, that activity is simply being done by the human, and they expect their account to belong to them and nobody else. So in password-based auth, the password is doing double duty. It is authenticating us and also being used by our local device typically to identify us to the local device. So once it's compromised, we've got all sorts of problems. In Fido, there's an authenticator, which we'll talk about in more detail. It will be a piece of hardware of some sort. An authenticator checks the user on the one side, makes sure that the user is there and is who they say they are. The presence check can be used on its own, by the way. So knowing that the user is there sometimes is enough to thwart an attack. Very similar to the "I'm not a robot" captures that you see, and you click on it and you think, well, why did I just click on that? Why does that prove I'm a robot? It's just proving that there's a user on the end of this session and not some script. And this is the same thing here. We're not just bulk brute forcing here. There is a user on the end, and the user has to press a button somewhere, indicate their presence at the hardware concerned. So there's not only the authenticator can just say, "Are you there?" but it, of course, most of the time will say, "and prove that you are who you say you are" as well. So it validates the user, at least their presence, but usually their identity as well. And then it'll do the authentication by using public-private key pairs that are pre-registered with the service. So just to make this blindingly obvious, that's our picture, which you've already seen, basic authentication. What we're talking about then is splitting the two. It's not just me providing a password and being authenticated. First of all, I need to verify myself to the device, and then my device will authenticate me to the service. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, that device is pretty clunky old computer by the look of it, but let's talk a little bit about what the authenticators can be. Fido was designed absolutely with flexibility in mind, so they're aware that there are lots of different use cases where you want to authenticate in lots of different situations, with or without hardware, with or without the ability to type, with or without the ability to show your face or your fingerprint or whatever. So the authenticators are very flexible. They divide them into two. There are platform authenticators, typically a TPM in a laptop, which is able to securely store certificate, well, key pairs or your private keys in particular. And there are roaming authenticators. These are the mobile pieces, the USB sticks, the NFC key fobs, or whatever else, mobile app secured with biometrics or whatever. So they're aware of the use cases that will need one or both of those in different situations. I've mentioned these modalities, just the term they use. There are two different requests that can be made to the authenticator. I need you to verify the user presence. In other words, just get the user to tap the contact on the device in some way to show that there is a user there, to verify this isn't a robot or a script of some sort, or actually verify the user, confirm that they are who they say they are with a factor, whether it's a PIN or a biometric or a gesture or a voice or an iris or a face, whatever it is that can be supported, and all of those things can be supported. And different devices made by different manufacturers can just deliberately support different feature sets depending on what they have. Does that device have a camera? Does it have a microphone? Does it have a fingerprint reader? So it's important that we understand, well, if I'm building a service that I want to be able to receive requests from Fido authenticators, how on earth do I know what I can expect from that? This is so flexible. How am I ever going to build a service that's going to work? And when I show you the architecture, you'll understand how that works. So first of all, a little bit more on authenticators. So we've got these two different sorts of authenticators, the platform type and the roaming type. The pictures I'll show you going forward are all based around the roaming because it's kind of normal to have a USB key these days with your Fido keys on it, but by no means excludes the ability to store them on your TPM on your laptop if that's the way you want to go. Makes them a bit less portable. So there they are. So there is a registration process. So I need to make sure that for a particular service, I've gone through a registration process where my authenticator, after appropriate verification, generates a public-private key pair, keeps the private key, and publishes the public key to the backend, whatever the shape of that backend is. And that clearly needs to be a secure process. One of the attack vectors on Fido, and they do exist, involves a man in the middle observing this registration process. Very sophisticated man in the middle, but if a man in the middle can observe this registration process, of course, they can subvert the process, and they can effectively proxy your authentication by issuing their own keys to the back end and saving your private key for themselves. It's a very unlikely, I think, sophisticated attack vector, but you need to know it exists. It's recognized by Fido themselves as a potential factor. So when you do the registration, it's important that that's clean and safe connection. The way the service works then, we've got an extra thing that's just appeared. On the right-hand side, we've got the verification process. So the user is being invited every time anything's done with a private key. The authenticator will only release the public key to go with it or sign anything with the private key. It'll only ever do that on verification with a PIN or some sort of fingerprint or biometric or whatever it is that that device supports. The exchanges are all done by so-called assertions. That's not particularly interesting. To start with, then I'll issue basically just the username. The server will challenge me, and I'll sign, or my authenticator will sign that challenge with the private key that I've released from the authenticator. That's the private key from the registration process that I'll release from the authenticator using whatever it is, a PIN, a biometric, or whatever it is that I'm doing. Now, at the top left, you can see the Fido service server. The Fido consortium provides a back-end service so that my service provider there, my relying party, my web server with the public key, so that it can query the device capabilities and say, okay, the device that is doing the assertion of the username in this case, what can it do? Has it got a camera? Has it got a microphone? Can it do fingerprints? What can it do? And the Fido service will deliver the device capabilities to the backend service so that you as a developer or a deployer of a service can make intelligent choices about what factors you're prepared to accept. You may decide that you don't accept any of the factors this device can do because it's too simple, or you don't trust the manufacturer, or whatever, but you can go ahead and query the Fido service. Now, that might have some privacy implications that we'll talk about in a moment, but that service exists for you to go and ask about the token that's being used and what it can do. So then you can form the appropriate challenge to say, I need you to confirm your identity in the following way, or one of the following ways, and then I send you the assertion. That's all fine. So we've basically seen this process before. Now, let's just tidy up the Fido thing. I haven't asked you how many of you know about Fido, but it's fairly, the term is well known. There's a new version that's been standardized since March this year, so it's reasonably new, and not all of us know about the various sort of acronyms that are used in the whole thing, so I thought I'd just tidy them up. So the original Fido protocols, basically two of them, U2F, which was the second factor protocol, multi-factor if you like, to go with a password. It did assume that it was the second factor against the password in that case. And UAF, which is the protocol for passwordless authentication. Those two things have been around for a while. And the need was seen to extend Fido to what is now Fido 2. And they've renamed a few things. So the U2F protocol has become CTAP1, the client to authenticator protocol. This is the conversation between the user and their authenticator, which does the verification. And CTAP2 is basically an extension of U2F, which contains passwordless authentication using external authentication authenticators. In other words, these roaming devices. So CTAP2 is now entirely passwordless capable. On the client and server side, there's an API, JavaScript API, which mediates the conversation between client and server, if you like, for authentication purposes. That's been standardized. That's the W3C standard since March, and it does the authentication. The API is built into lots of clients, as you can see, Windows 10 and those browsers. And this means that many of the devices you have out there are already Fido capable. The question is, what backend services are you going to be using? If you're commissioning development or you're purchasing systems, then it's going to be worth asking whether they are Fido compliant, because that's really where you want to be. Now, I'm going to explain why it's where you want to be in a minute, but there you go. So Fido 2, the term, is the combination of the CTAP2 protocol and the web authentication API. Okay, that's what Fido 2 is. It's that pair of items that gives us full passwordless capabilities, including remote authenticators. I'm going to mention channel-bound authentication in a minute. Channel binding is an issue that security people have been concerned about for a while. I'll talk about it in detail when we've got the relevant picture, but I want to be on the technologies page just for completeness. Important to bear in mind, Fido is all about flexibility. So depending on your use case, for let's say 90% of your users, you might be able to issue a hardware token, but you're going to have users that you can't get a hardware token to, or they've got nowhere to put one, or whatever. And in that case, you may not be able to use Fido at all. You may not be able to use pins on some because you have no way of typing, so then you have to go password or fingerprint or iris or face recognition. So you're going to need flexibility depending on your use cases, and Fido is designed to be flexible. That's why we have all these different protocols going on, which are reasonably complex but provide us with very, very high flexibility. So let's just get into it a little bit. So in the sort of picture we've been using, this doesn't always have to look like this, of course. You may not be using an identity provider. The web server may be Fido compliant entirely on its own, but let's use the model we've got. We are making a username assertion. We're going and saying, this is my username and log me in with Fido. So we're not making any other assertion about passwords or anything. The Fido backend is going to, the web authentication backend is going to make it a challenge. We're going to sign it with our private key. We've basically seen this before. Let's look at the attack scenario. So what can the attacker get? The main thing here is that the signing of the assertion is no longer happening at the web server. It's happening at the client side, well away from our attacker. So the attacker has never seen anything except a username. And this, of course, is we haven't given him anything that is basically reusable. The only thing that he gets is this particular challenge for this particular session signed with my private key. He's got to relay that because the signature is going to get checked. He can't change anything about it. He's got to relay that to the backend server. In this particular case, if we do nothing further, the man in the middle does get a session. Okay, but the only private information he's got from me is one challenge signed with the private key and my username. So we're already better off than the MFA variants we saw earlier, where he typically gets my password, even if you can't do very much with it. In this case, no password is used, so we're a little bit cleaner. We, of course, and Fido, of course, want to go a step further and be able to say this is absolutely phishing proof. And in that case, we have to talk about channel binding. So channel binding is the idea that the Fido tokens themselves can be bound to a particular TLS channel. So the idea is that when I sign the challenge, I add information to the challenge saying, I am answering this on this TLS channel. Now, this TLS channel for me is between me, the client, and the man in the middle, that service. So that information is put into the challenge and then signed. Now, that's unchangeable. The attacker cannot change that because it's signed with my private key. So the attacker has to relay that to the back end, and the back end can look at its TLS and it can say, well, what was I expecting? The back end can say, I'm having a conversation with on a completely different TLS channel. In other words, it's not communicating, it thinks, with the man in the middle. It's communicating with an honest web server because that's the one that's registered with it. And it says that's a channel mismatch. This challenge has been relayed via a third party that I know nothing about, and it's therefore not trustworthy. And this is channel binding. This applies to cookies and it applies to various other all sorts of TLS fundamental securities, and we're increasingly using channel binding to prevent replay attacks of various sorts, including TLS session keys and things like that. So channel binding does apply to Fido assertions, can be applied to Fido assertions. It is optional. You just need to be aware that anything that breaks the TLS channel, like content inspection at your perimeter, if you're breaking the TLS channel and inspecting contents, you will break channel binding. So you may not be able to use this in every corporate scenario, but you need to be aware it does exist, and it is for this reason that Fido is generally recognized as a non-phishable protocol. It's a protocol that does protect you from phishing attacks when it's fully implemented. As usual, there are compromises involved. If you have a particular situation where you can't use channel binding, you don't get the full protection. But as we've already said, the man in the middle doesn't get really anything very usable. He will get a session. He's in the way in between you and your session if you don't use channel binding. So the very least you're expected to do is to channel bind your cookies so that they are not issued to a foreign TLS channel that wasn't the one that you thought it was. That's not a subject for today, but the recommendation is to use Fido ideally with channel binding. But if you can't use Fido with channel binding, at least apply channel binding to your cookies, which should prevent the attacker from getting a session cookie as a result of a spoofed authentication. So that is the technical background to Fido, which I think is pretty cool. I want to get a bit real. Privacy, we care about privacy generally speaking. So the good thing about Fido, the keys that go out to the visited sites are unique, and therefore if you went around querying sites and saying what keys have you got, you can't correlate users. You can't say the same user has got accounts on these different services and build some sort of a profile. Okay. Any biometric data does not leave the authenticator. It's all done. Any use of it it's entirely used locally on the authenticator. That limits your flexibility a bit. There are biometric systems that obviously hash your biometrics, hopefully, and then store those hashes on a server so that you can use biometrics from a sort of roaming basis. This is not the approach that Fido take. Fido take the approach that your token will roam with you, your authenticated device, and there's no need to store your authentication information on any central server. We talked a bit about the Fido backend service that your services can query to work out what particular devices can do. The tokens are not uniquely identified, so the tokens have an ID, but the backend service does not contain a full itemized list of all the IDs and which token they are. If they did, then you could profile a user by tracking requests made to that backend service, saying when did this particular token make an access request, and you could do some anti-privacy stuff if you were particularly evil. but they deliberately made it so that the IDs are stored in blocks in the backend server related to a particular manufacturer and a particular type of device. So all you can query is, here's the ID, give me a general idea about the device. So the server does not store any ID specific, so token specific information. So it's generally recognized as being pretty good for privacy as well. Focus on Microsoft quickly. So Fido is baked into Windows 10, Fido 2 this is, baked into Windows 10. Azure, in particular Azure Active Directory, has Fido 2 MFA in public preview. If you want to try it out, you need to probably visit that website that I've listed there. It lists specific authenticators that you should use. They have to support a PIN, for example. It's not necessarily because the preview is very limited, it's just that there are particular use cases that Azure AD expects you to have. And so it, at the moment, requires you to have certain authenticators, so you should know what they are. Azure MFA, as some of you will also know, supports one-time passwords via SMS, via token, via app, push notification to apps. As we've already said, those methods are not entirely unphishable, but they're a great deal better than not having anything at all. And for the use cases that you will undoubtedly have where you cannot issue hardware devices to all of your users, you might find that you can use other devices in your Azure MFA environment. As far as integration is concerned, if you're using Azure AD managed authentication, it's fundamentally MFA capable, so you can use your MFA providers, including Fido 2 there. If you're using federated or some sort of on-premises authentication, you will need some sort of adapter to get that on-premises or federated unit talking to some MFA server. In this case, we'll be talking about Azure MFA. And if you're integrating with particularly perimeter devices like Juniper VPNs or Citrix or various things that you're going to have for remote access, there is an NPS extension for Azure MFA that supports Radius. Most of these perimeter tools support Radius, so they'll send a Radius request saying, give me a yes or no for this authentication. That gets booted up to Azure MFA for a request and for verification. And provided the MFA is successful, it'll get a yes back and let the user into the network or Citrix, whatever you're looking for. I've got a question. Authenticate. My window's not big enough. 1 second. My window is distinctly not big enough. Let's pop this out. Any idea when Azure MFA will support PIN with SMS and not in the app? Okay. Yes. Unfortunately not. No. I'm afraid I can't fill you in on that. Although, yeah, I think with SMS, I mean, SMS, if you're interested in what NIST say don't use SMS MFA because it's fundamentally not very secure. But certainly the Authenticator app will support some sort of local PIN or fingerprint. Already does in some use cases, as you probably know. But I think it's certainly coming for Azure, as you're apparently aware, but I can't put a date on that, I'm afraid. Okay, so yeah, so this really starting to wrap us up a little bit. I just thought I'd ask you, having now talked about this, if you use MFA, if you'd like to share with me what you're using. It's always interesting for me to know how far you've got, if you like. I didn't put password reset on this slide, but it is one of the questions. So we're asking about client authentication, in other words, people authenticating to their local computer or device, remote access, so perimeter type stuff, app proxies or Citrix or VPNs like Juniper, and internal MFA for, I have customers who say every administrator must use MFA to access their server, for example. And it can also be used for password reset. So I'm just going to put up a quick poll. Again, no compulsion to vote, but I'd be interested in your thoughts if you care to share with me. Yes, so everyone who's voted is using it for remote access. I didn't give you a we're not using MFA, so I guess I'm only getting some of you. Yeah, so 50% client auth, 50% password reset, roughly, and in, yeah, I mean, pretty much literally 100% remote access. I'll just give you a few more seconds, but remote access is the typical approach. If you're using non-Microsoft MFA in your DMZ or whatever for the remote access, the radius integration with the NPS server is quite straightforward and well worth pursuing. Right, thank you for that poll. So, in summary then, what I wanted to do with this webinar was just talk about the different MFAs that there are, because I have a lot of conversations with less technical people where they say, well, we've got MFA, we must be good, right? And there's a lot of misinformation or a lack of deep understanding about what sorts of MFA there are, how attackable they are, what the differences are, and so on. So I wanted to talk about that in this webinar. So it's certainly the case that all MFA is better than no MFA, with the slight exception of really insecure MFA, where it might just give you a false sense of security. But let's assume that all MFA is better than no MFA. Different use cases will need different types of implementations. We've talked about the ability of your ability to get a device to a user. There are all sorts of interesting use cases where surgeons can't type or can't show their face. They have to authenticate somehow. So how does that work? These sorts of things. And Fido, I can't stress enough, is phishing proof, passwordless, and should be a goal for your core use cases. And that is really the message I wanted to give you. So that takes me to the thank you page. Thank you so much for being here. If you've got any further questions, I've got a couple of minutes. Otherwise, we've got a couple of other webinars coming up. Interesting one about machine learning from our machine learning big data specialist, and yeah, another good solid subject of hybrid identity with MIM and Azure AD Connect. So thank you so much for being here. I will leave the session open for a couple of minutes in case there are questions, but otherwise do come again, and I hope to see you on another webinar.